I watched as Havana slowly came to life in the twilight. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, and a warm breeze, like gentle fingers, brushed against my skin. Richard and I had just arrived at this faraway Cuban plantation, owned by my father, Alejandro. This was his kingdom, his world, far removed from the grayness of London that I so desperately wanted to escape. My fiancé, Richard, always so confident and successful in his restaurant business, seemed a little lost here. Our marriage had not been going well lately. Richard was completely absorbed in his work. His restaurants required constant attention, new projects, business meetings. I knew he was tired, and I felt our life had turned into an endless routine. We tried to talk about it, but every conversation turned into an argument. He accused me of not understanding how important his business development was to him, while I felt he was simply avoiding the real issues. That's when I decided we needed a change, a break from London, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle. I suggested we go to my father's coffee plantation in Havana. Here, amidst tropical gardens and ocean breezes, I hoped Richard could finally relax, take a break from work, and maybe focus on us, on our relationship, which I felt was beginning to fade. He agreed, perhaps out of guilt, or maybe because he also realized we were losing each other. "I know you're looking for something here," he said to me on the plane, his gaze tired but soft. "But are you sure this will help?" "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But at least we should try, Richard. We have to try." My father's house stood amidst lush tropical gardens, surrounded by old coffee trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the wind. I felt the ocean breeze, carrying the scent of salt and greenery, fill every corner of this house, breathing life into it. We came here hoping that this trip would help us find what we had lost. It was here that I met Raphael, my father's friend, the owner of a workshop for repairing vintage cars and motorcycles. When our eyes met, I felt a strange excitement, and despite Richard's presence, something within me subtly shifted. The next day, we decided to spend more time with my father. The morning began with a long breakfast on the terrace, where Alejandro shared stories of his childhood on the plantation and how he had dedicated his life to this place. He was passionate and deeply committed to his work, yet he retained a lightness and humor that made him incredibly charming. I could see how his eyes lit up when he talked about coffee and his garden. His stories calmed me, making me feel like a little girl again, unafraid of anything in the world. Richard, on the other hand, sat across from us, smiling reservedly, his thoughts seemingly far away. He was tall and lean, with thick dark hair slightly graying at the temples, which gave him a certain nobility. In London, he always looked impeccable. A suit, a tie, expensive watches. Here, in Havana, in more casual attire, he seemed slightly out of place, as if he didn't quite understand how to fit into this world, so far from his usual environment. I knew it was hard for him to disconnect from work. His phone hadn't stopped ringing even here, but I hoped that, with time, he would relax and start enjoying the moment. After breakfast, Raphael, my father's friend, came to visit us. Tall and sturdy, with tanned skin and a confident smile, he invited us on a tour of Havana's old streets. He suggested we ride on one of the motorcycles he had restored himself. Richard was initially cautious about the idea, but agreed under my gaze. "It will be an interesting adventure," Raphael said, a spark in his eyes. "You'll see Havana as only the locals know it." Richard tried to smile, but his face remained tense. We followed Raphael, and I couldn't help but admire his skill in handling the motorcycle, the ease with which he led us through narrow cobblestone streets. He knew every detail of this city, every story. At some point, I noticed Richard glancing at me as I listened to Raphael's stories with obvious interest. I felt his hand tighten on the motorcycle handlebar. He was starting to get jealous, and it left me with mixed feelings. I even liked his jealousy to some extent. It was a reminder that I still mattered to him, that even after all these years, he was still willing to fight for me, for our happiness. When we returned, Raphael offered to show us his workshop. We entered a space filled with the scent of engine oil and old leather, and I immediately felt like I was in a world where every wheel, every part had its own story. Raphael shared how he found abandoned motorcycles and brought them back to life, restoring every detail with love and patience. His passion was contagious, and I found myself increasingly drawn to his stories. Richard, in contrast, seemed to withdraw more into himself. He couldn't understand why I was so interested in this man, and it seemed his jealousy was only growing. Raphael seemed to enjoy his reaction, drawing me further into his stories and mysterious looks. After dinner, Raphael suggested we go on a night ride along the coast. His offer came unexpectedly, and I immediately felt a surge of excitement. Richard, on the other hand, seemed too tired. He had spent a lot of time on his laptop, dealing with some work issues, and when Raphael made his suggestion, he just waved it off. "I'll stay," he said, rubbing his eyes. "I have a few things I need to finish." I understood that Richard had been spending more and more time working, even here in Havana, and honestly, it was starting to annoy me. So I quickly agreed to Raphael's offer, hoping it would help me distract myself from my thoughts and unwind a little. We set off on one of Raphael's motorcycles. Nighttime Havana was especially enchanting. The streetlights cast a soft glow, and the city seemed full of hidden stories. Raphael rode confidently, as if he knew every bump in the road. I held onto his waist tightly, feeling the wind tousle my hair. Along the way, Raphael began to talk about his life. He spoke of his dreams, how he ended up in Havana, and how he found his calling in restoring old cars. His voice was calm and assured, but I felt there was something else behind his words, something unclear and mysterious. My intuition told me Raphael wasn't telling the whole story, but I paid it no mind. I was captivated by his stories and the sense of freedom this night ride was giving me. We stopped at an old lighthouse perched on the edge of a cliff, offering a breathtaking view of the ocean. The moonlight illuminated the water's surface, and I felt my heart start to beat faster. Raphael got off the motorcycle and extended his hand to help me down. "This lighthouse is one of my favorite places," he said, gazing into the distance. "I come here when I need to think or feel free." I stood next to him, feeling something invisible but very strong growing between us. We silently watched the water, and I realized that this ride had become something more for me than just a night out. Raphael attracted me, and I couldn't deny it, even to myself. "You really love this place," I said quietly, trying to hide the embarrassment in my voice. "Yes," he replied, not taking his eyes off the ocean. "But right now, I'm more interested in another person." His words made me shiver. I felt my cheeks flush, and I realized that my feelings for him were much deeper than I had imagined. We stood side by side at the old lighthouse, immersed in the night silence, broken only by the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The tension in the air grew more palpable with each passing moment. Raphael suddenly looked at me, and I saw his eyes soften, his gaze deepen. "From the first moment I saw you, I felt something special, Jenny," he said, and there was something sincere in his voice that left no room for doubt. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a wave of anxiety and joy rising within my chest. He slowly reached out and gently touched my hand, his fingers gliding over my skin, and suddenly I felt a jolt of electricity run through my entire body. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to take my eyes off his face. Raphael moved closer to me, his face nearing mine, and I could feel his breath on my skin. I knew I should stop, that this was wrong. But I couldn't. Everything inside me seemed to scream that I shouldn't do this, but my lips were already moving toward his. When his lips touched mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A spark, a living warmth that spread throughout my body. It was an overwhelming sensation, and in that moment, I forgot everything. Richard, our marriage, all the rules and boundaries. All that existed at that moment was Raphael's touch and my response to his kiss. But suddenly, I seemed to snap out of it, pulling away sharply. My head spun with mixed feelings, passion, guilt, and confusion. "We need to go back," I said quietly, avoiding his gaze, feeling my cheeks burn. Raphael seemed a little surprised, but quickly regained his composure and nodded. "Yes, of course. Let's go." We got on the motorcycle and headed back to the plantation. And then the sky erupted with a deafening thunder, and a heavy tropical downpour hit us suddenly, as if reminding me that emotions could be just as unpredictable as the weather. The rain was so strong that I was instantly soaked to the bone. My hair stuck to my face, and my light dress became heavy and wet, clinging to my skin. Raphael drove the motorcycle cautiously but confidently, ignoring the streams of water flooding the road. I held onto his waist tighter than before, feeling his back becoming wet under his clothes. The rain was cold, but Raphael's presence warmed me, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the lighthouse. I realized I was returning to the plantation a different person, with a new awareness of myself and my feelings. We were riding through the pouring rain, which lashed our faces like thousands of cold needles. Raphael rode the motorcycle confidently, but I could see he was looking for shelter from the relentless downpour. Soon, we spotted an old, abandoned shed by the side of the road. Raphael turned and guided the motorcycle directly toward it. "Let's stop here until the rain lets up," he suggested, dismounting and helping me off. I didn't object. We quickly ran inside the shed, taking cover from the rain pounding on the roof with a deafening noise. My hair stuck to my face, my dress was cold and heavy, clinging to my body, and I began to shiver from the cold. Raphael noticed this and took off his jacket, offering it to me. "Here, put this on. It'll keep you warm." His voice was soft, almost caring. I took the jacket and put it on, feeling its warmth surround me. But it wasn't just the jacket's warmth. I felt Raphael's presence beside me, his scent, his breath. And it warmed me more than any clothing could. The shed was old and cramped, filled with the smell of damp wood and dust. We stood so close that I could hear his breathing and feel his hand near mine. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it would leap out of my chest. Raphael looked at me, and I couldn't stand his gaze, so piercing, so deep. "You're shivering," he said quietly, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the tension. I nodded, not knowing what to say. He stepped closer, his hand gently touching my cheek. The gesture was so tender, yet determined that I couldn't resist. Our lips met, and I felt the same spark as at the lighthouse, but now it flared into a flame. I knew I was making a mistake, but I couldn't stop. I felt not just attraction, but a passion I hadn't felt in a long time. The kiss grew deeper, our breaths mingled, and I realized I couldn't control myself. His arms wrapped around me, and my fingers instinctively began to slide over his shoulders, down his neck, through his hair. We lost ourselves in this moment, forgetting everything, the world around us, our past, and our future. Our touches became more intense, and I knew I could no longer fight these feelings. We were trapped in this old shed, and time seemed to stand still for the two of us. We returned to the plantation with the sound of the rain still pounding around us. I felt my feet barely moving on the wet ground, and my mind was in chaos, filled with feelings and thoughts. My heart was beating unevenly, as if trying to determine which direction to go next. I tried to convince myself that everything that had happened was a mistake, that I should forget it. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the secret desire to see what might come next with Raphael. The uncertainty drew me in, but I knew it was leading me to the edge of a cliff. Raphael noticed my state. He approached closer, his gaze serious, almost anxious. I felt his hands lightly touch my shoulders as if he was about to say something important. "Jenny, we need to talk," he began, his voice soft but tense. "About what?" I tried to remain calm, though everything inside me was turning upside down. He paused for a moment as if gathering his thoughts, then finally spoke the words that broke my heart. "I have a wife and a child," he finally said, and his words pierced me like a knife. The world around me suddenly became dull and blurry. I stared at him, not believing what I was hearing. All my dreams, all my illusions crumbled in an instant. I felt my throat tighten with pain, and tears began to fill my eyes. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I managed to say, my voice trembling. Raphael looked at me with a sad understanding. I thought I could hold back, that it wouldn't go this far. But I was wrong, Jenny. I'm sorry. I realized that he only wanted me as his mistress, not to give me a chance for something more. I felt deceived and betrayed. Everything I had given him in those brief moments had been nothing more than a game in his hands. I felt the cold reality hit me in the face. All this passion, all these feelings I had lived with for the past few days, were just an illusion, an empty dream. And the worst part was that I had ruined my relationship with Richard for this illusion. "I don't want to hear anything more," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "We should end all contact. This was a mistake." Raphael wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned away and walked off, feeling the tears streaming down my cheeks. When I returned to the plantation, the feeling of emptiness wouldn't leave me. The rain had finally stopped, but the drops were still dripping from the roofs and leaves, creating a quiet, monotonous sound, as if underlining my depressed state. I walked slowly, not knowing how to explain everything to Richard. I wanted to disappear, not to see his eyes full of expectation and worry. As soon as I entered the house, Richard immediately noticed my state. His eyes narrowed, and he came closer to me. "What happened, Jenny?" "You look different," he said, and his voice held a mix of concern and suspicion. Fear and guilt overwhelmed me. I wanted to lie, to avoid the conversation, but I knew the truth could not be hidden. "We need to talk," I whispered, barely daring to meet his gaze. We sat in the living room and I began to speak. The words came out heavily, like lead. I told him about Raphael, how it all started, my feelings, and what happened in the shed. I saw Richard's face grow paler and his eyes widen in shock. "You let him," he trailed off, and I saw his hands clench into fists. "You let him go that far?" My voice broke, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't know how it happened, Richard. Everything happened so fast." His eyes flared with anger. He stood up abruptly, as if he couldn't sit still any longer. "Where is Raphael?" His voice was tight, but I saw determination in his gaze. "I need to talk to him, right now." "Richard, please." I tried to stop him. "It won't change anything." But he didn't listen to me. I could see he was determined to confront Raphael face to face. His steps were quick as he left the house and began searching the plantation. But Raphael seemed to have disappeared. His motorcycle was gone, and he had left somewhere, and no one knew where. Richard returned a few minutes later, his face even darker. He looked confused, but the fire in his eyes still burned. "He's gone," he finally said, looking straight into my eyes. "And you, stay here. I can't be around you anymore. I'm leaving. I need time to think." His words pierced me like a knife. I realized this was the end, that I had lost everything. Richard went back into the house, quickly packed his things, and without saying another word, walked to his car. I stood there, paralyzed, and watched as he got behind the wheel and drove away, leaving me alone on this cursed plantation. After Richard left, I remained alone at the plantation, in my father's house. The silence around me was only occasionally broken by the sounds of nature. I felt lost and empty, but deep down, I knew I had to do something, or this feeling of emptiness would consume me entirely. I decided to stay in Havana and focus on my art career. It was not an easy decision, but perhaps the only right one. I began to seek inspiration around me, observing people, buildings, street markets, everything that made this city so vibrant and unique. I met a few local artists who invited me to join their plein air sessions, where we painted views of Havana in the open air. I felt the brush stroke across the canvas, the colors mixing on the palette. But my thoughts kept returning to Raphael. His lies and betrayal, his confessions, and kisses still tormented me. I was angry at him, angry at myself for allowing myself to get carried away, for destroying everything I had. And Richard. I had betrayed his trust, ruined our marriage. I felt the word, betrayal, burning inside me. I had lost someone who loved me despite all our problems, despite everything that divided us. He left because I had made a choice that could not be undone. But despite this, I didn't want to give up. I understood that life was not over, that even from the darkest places, one could find a path to light. I decided I had to fight for my happiness, find my place in this world, even if the path would be long and difficult. I started spending more time working, immersing myself in creativity as a saving island of calm. I painted not only Havana, but also what was happening inside me. Pain, doubts, fears, but also hope. My work became more emotional, more sincere, and the local artists began to notice me. "Your works, they have become so alive," said one of the artists with whom I spent a lot of time. "You've put your soul into them." I nodded, realizing that perhaps, for the first time in my life, I had truly opened myself through art. I decided I would fight, despite everything that had happened. I wouldn't let the past define my future. I would seek my happiness, wherever it might be, no matter what this path might bring. I returned to London, and it felt like plunging into another world. Everything was different here: the gray sky, the cold air, the hustle and bustle of the city. I felt the weight of this place pressing on me, reminding me of everything I had lost. But I knew I had to come back. I had to try to fix what I had broken. Richard agreed to meet me, though I could see it wasn't easy for him. We chose a neutral place, a cafe near our home, to discuss what had happened and try to understand if there was anything left to save in our marriage. When I walked in, he was already sitting at the table. He looked tired, his eyes tense. I sat down across from him and felt my heart tighten with fear and regret. "I don't know where to start," I said, trying to catch his gaze. "Start with the truth," he replied quietly. "Why did you do it?" I took a deep breath and confessed everything I had felt at that moment. About my longing, the routine, the loneliness that had built up inside me. How it seemed to me that our relationship no longer made sense, and how I found something new in Havana, not realizing it was just an illusion. Richard listened carefully, not interrupting. I saw his face change as I spoke. Pain, disappointment, anger, all of it flashed in his eyes. But when I finished, He remained silent, just looking at me. "You want me to forgive you, is that it?" he finally said. "I want you to give us another chance," I replied. "I know I made a mistake. I know I betrayed your trust. But I'm willing to change. I'm willing to work on our relationship to get back what we lost." He was silent, looking away. Several long moments of silence seemed to stretch into eternity. Finally, he sighed and said, "All right, let's try. But Jenny, this won't be easy. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, but I'm willing to give it another chance." We decided to try to start over. We spent time together, trying to restore the connection that had once been so strong. We walked through familiar places, visited old favorite restaurants, and tried to bring back the moments that once made us happy. But I saw the shadow of the past constantly standing between us. In his eyes, I saw a pain I could not erase. "Do you think we can make it?" I asked one evening when we were sitting on a bench in the park where we often walked at the beginning of our relationship. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "I want to believe we can, but sometimes I can't help thinking about what happened. It's always with me, Jenny." I realized that time was the only judge that could pass a verdict on our story. But despite this, I was ready to fight. I knew that if we wanted to save what we had left, we had to do everything possible. Weeks passed, but I felt the shadow of our past still hanging over us. Richard and I tried to rebuild what we had lost, but every effort seemed only to deepen the divide between us. He tried to be patient, to be closer, but I could see that the pain of what had happened wouldn't let him go. We continued spending time together, dinners, walks, even a trip out of town. But behind every conversation, behind every smile, I could feel his doubts. In his eyes, there was always the same question: why? I tried to explain, to be honest and open, but nothing seemed to help. One evening, as we sat in the living room, he finally broke the silence that had lingered between us for so long. "I thought I could handle this," he began, his voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. "But every time I look at you, I remember that you were willing to throw away everything we had for some fleeting feelings for another man." I was silent, not knowing what to say. He was right. I had allowed myself to get carried away, and it had cost us everything we once had. "I tried to fix it, Richard," I whispered. "I know I made a huge mistake, but I didn't want to lose you. I wanted to bring everything back." He shook his head, his face like stone. "I know you're trying, Jenny, but I can't forget. I can't forgive. Every time I think about you being ready to leave, it tears me apart." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I tried not to let them show. It hurt, but I knew he was right. Our attempts to go back to the past were doomed. "What do you suggest?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed and looked down. "I think we need to separate," he said quietly. "Maybe it's the only way to move on, for both of us." I knew this decision was the right one, but that didn't make it any less painful. I realized that our efforts to restore the past had been in vain. I saw that his pain was too great to simply disappear. "I understand," I replied, feeling my heart tighten with sorrow. "I'm sorry it came to this." He nodded, and a tear glistened in his eyes. We both knew this was the end, and that we would have to go our separate ways. We sat in silence, knowing that our paths had diverged, that neither of us could bring back the past, no matter how bright it seemed. Richard and I finally broke up. Our last conversation was heavy, but also liberating. I felt like a huge weight I had been carrying for months had finally fallen from my shoulders. The pain remained, but in that pain, there was something new, a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized I could no longer live in the past, and that it was time to move forward. To truly start over, I needed to focus on myself, on what I truly loved, and what gave me strength. I decided to pour new energy into my art career, making it my way to find myself again. Inspiration found me where I least expected it, in my own experiences. I began working on a series of new paintings that reflected everything I had gone through over the past months: pain, disappointment, searching, and finally, acceptance. Each canvas was infused with my feelings, my way of expressing what I couldn't put into words. After a few weeks, I decided I was ready to show my work to the world. I reached out to several galleries, and to my surprise, I received positive responses. I was invited to hold an exhibition, and I agreed, feeling this was my chance to start fresh. At the exhibition opening, I stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by my paintings, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. My work spoke for me. They told my story, my journey from a broken heart to finding new hope. I watched as people stopped in front of my paintings, examining them, trying to understand what lay behind the brush strokes and colors. I felt a connection forming between me and the viewers, as if they could feel what I felt, even without knowing all the details of my story. This exhibition was not just a step forward in my career, but also a significant milestone in my journey toward self-discovery. I realized that art had become not only a way for me to express my emotions, but also a path to inner healing. Saying goodbye to Richard was still a painful memory, but I no longer felt lost. I knew new chapters and new beginnings awaited me, and though I didn't yet know where they would lead, I was ready to face them with an open heart. The exhibition turned out to be a much bigger success than I could have imagined. From the very first days, the gallery was filled with people, critics, collectors, art enthusiasts. I watched them discuss my works, their eyes lingering on the canvases longer than usual, as if they were searching for answers to questions that troubled them. I felt that my paintings had struck a chord, and this filled me with new strength. Critics began writing articles about my exhibition, mentioning it in prestigious magazines. They praised the courage with which I expressed my feelings and experiences, and many noted the uniqueness of my style, its emotional power and depth. Collectors became interested in my works, and some even placed orders for new paintings. These responses inspired me. I realized I could do more than I had ever thought. My art gained a new purpose and meaning. I began working on new projects, allowing myself to take risks, experiment, and explore new themes and techniques. There was more light and color in my paintings, more life. I realized that art had become not just a way to express my emotions, but also a means of healing. Every brushstroke, every canvas helped me release the pain I had experienced in recent months. I found new strength within myself that I hadn't even known existed. I felt alive again, full of energy and determination to move forward. The past hadn't disappeared, but I no longer felt it holding me captive. I had learned to use my experiences as a source of inspiration, as a tool to create something beautiful and meaningful. I understood that even the most painful experiences could lead to growth and change if I allowed myself to accept them and turn them into creativity. My works began to sell, bringing me not only financial stability, but also confidence in my abilities. I started dreaming of larger exhibitions, of traveling to other cities and countries to showcase my work beyond London. I realized that my journey was just beginning. It was an incredible feeling to understand that I could be strong, independent, and creative. Art had become my salvation, my way to express myself and find inner harmony. I knew there would still be many challenges and difficulties ahead, but I was ready for them, full of confidence and inspiration. My days were filled with new encounters, discoveries, and impressions. I felt like I was finally beginning to let go of the past, finding new sources of inspiration and strength. My travels had taken me to different corners of the world, and each new city brought something fresh into my life. It was just when I was starting to feel truly free that Raphael called me. His voice was still deep and calm, but there was a note of hesitation in it. "Jenny," he began, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "I wanted to talk to you. I've left my wife. I've realized I made a mistake and that I've been thinking about you all this time." I froze, trying to process his words. He continued, explaining how he had come to understand his feelings and how he wanted to start over, with me. "I want you to come to me," he said, his voice filled with hope. "Let's try again. We could still make it work." My initial reaction was a mix of surprise and confusion. I remembered how deeply I had been attached to him, how much it had hurt to learn about his lies. But now, when he offered to start over, I didn't feel any joy. Instead, I felt a deep understanding that I did not want to return to that past that had brought me so much pain. "No, Raphael," I said after a long silence. "I appreciate your honesty, but I can't go back. I've fought too hard to get out of that place. I can't dive back into the past." He fell silent, as if he hadn't expected that response. I heard him sigh, his disappointment evident. "I understand," he finally replied. "I'm sorry things turned out this way." "So am I," said, feeling a sense of relief rising in my chest. "But we both need to move on. We each have our own life, and I hope you find your path too." When I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calm. At that moment, I realized I was no longer holding on to the illusions of the past. Raphael had been part of my journey, but he was in the past, and I did not want to go back to him. I realized that my path now lay in a different direction, and that life continued to move forward despite all the mistakes and losses. I decided to continue my travels, discovering new horizons, knowing that every road I took helped me find myself. Returning to London after my long journey, I felt that I had finally found peace within myself. The city welcomed me with its familiar hustle and bustle, gray skies and rainy streets, but now all of it seemed different to me. I felt an inner calm I hadn't known for a long time. Every corner, every sound of the city seemed to fill me with life once again. I decided it was time to start a new series of paintings inspired by my experiences. This time, I wanted not just to express my emotions, but to capture everything I had learned about myself, about the world, and about how important it is to accept one's mistakes and move forward. I began working on paintings filled with light, bright colors, and gentle shades, everything I had seen and felt during my travels. My new works were a reflection of my inner world, not perfect, but sincere and alive. I found joy in simple things, in a cup of hot coffee in the morning, in long walks in the park, in conversations with friends. I began to notice beauty in the most ordinary moments that had once seemed to pass me by. Each painting I created became, for me, a kind of manifesto about accepting myself and my mistakes. I realized that my mistakes were not just failures, but an important part of my journey. They taught me many things, to be honest with myself, to value what I have, and to strive for what I truly want from life. I no longer regretted the past. On the contrary, I saw in it valuable lessons that had made me stronger and wiser. I understood that none of my experiences had been in vain. Each of them helped me get closer to understanding who I am and what I want. My new series of paintings became a symbol of this realization. I decided to hold another exhibition, but this time not to prove anything or gain recognition. I wanted to share my experience, my joy, and the peace I had found within myself. and as I looked at my paintings, I felt gratitude for everything that had happened in my life. For every mistake, for every trial, for every step that had led me here. I knew there was still much unknown ahead, but I was ready to face it all with an open heart and a clear vision.